I've been translating the Odyssey lately and some of the Iliad, and it's been quite fascinating. Ancient Greek has a very rich and deep meaning behind the words that it uses that English just doesn't have. So I've been having quite an interesting time translating it, and I'm going to be sharing it with you guys, my process of going through it. Although I've translated some of the Iliad, I've translated more of the Odyssey. So I'm going to be focusing on the Odyssey. Just to give a little background, the Iliad is about the Trojan War, this 10-year-long siege between the Greek kingdoms and Troy. The book mainly focuses on Achilles and Agamemnon and the strife between them. The Odyssey, however, is about the journey home, and Odysseus runs into a lot of trouble, and his journey takes 10 years. So you can imagine, after being 10 years at war and longing to go back home, you get delayed for another 10 years. I mean, this is just agony, quite excruciating. And this is what the Odyssey is about. It's about all the events that happened during Odysseus' journey home, but it's really about his suffering, and the Greeks loved literature on suffering. So I'm just going to be going through in this episode just the first few opening lines, break down the grammar, and delve in deep into the meaning of the words. The pronunciation is another monster entirely. That's not something I'm going to be focusing too much on. The poems are in dactylic hexameter, and there is so much variation into how people say these lines and the rhythm that they use. It's just ridiculous. So I'm not really going to be focusing too much on that. So without further ado, here is the beginning of the Odyssey. Andra moi enebe musa, polutropon hos malapola plankte, epetroies hieron botoliatron epersen. Alright, I'm going to break it down comma by comma, starting with the clause andra moi enebe musa. So these graphics I've displayed here are the linguistic grammatical breakdown of the clause. So the translation is, speak to me of the man, O Muse. Alright, so the first thing to say is that there's no sequence, right? There's no word ordering that you have to follow. You can place words in any order, kind of like Russian. So it becomes something you have to pay attention to, is the word order, which word is placed first particularly. The Greeks put the most important word first and foremost. So when it comes to a book, you can imagine the first word is of utmost importance. In the Iliad, the first word was mīnin, the accusative form of mīnis. A professor by the name of Leonard Muellner wrote an entire book on this word, so you can understand why this word was chosen first. It has a very deep and powerful meaning behind it, but that's for another video. And here though, in the Odyssey, you have andra, just meaning man, applying to Odysseus. And it's interesting because later on you find out that the gods deeply respect Odysseus, and Odysseus is even called Antitheos, meaning rival to the gods. So this makes it all the more puzzling to why andra is the first word. So keeping that in mind, we'll carry on. Polutropon hos malapola plankte. So the previous translation was, speak to me of the man, O Muse, that much-travelled man who was led to veer off course in many different ways. So the first thing to mention is this word polutropon, which is being applied to Odysseus. This adjective is a composite word from polus, meaning many, and tropon, meaning ways or turns, together meaning many turns. Liddell and Scott have it as much turned, turning many ways, also as much travelled or much wandering. It has a metaphorical meaning of being shifty, versatile, or wily. It's quite often applied to Hermes, a god. So already we're seeing this contrast. You have the first word andra, man, and then a adjective that applied to Hermes, a god. There is a lecture series on the Odyssey. It is produced by the Centre for Hellenic Studies, and I'll put the link in the description. And they have some interesting commentary, but they don't quite go too much into the grammatical analysis. One of the professors, Gregory Nage, has this word polutropos, translated as man of ever-changing identities, as Hermes was. So it seems like Odysseus is quite socially proficient. The verb plankte is from plasdor, meaning to make to wander, to make to roam about. But it's in the passive voice here, meaning Odysseus is the one being led about. This is in reference to him trying to get home, because after the Trojan War, after the events of the Iliad, is where the Odyssey takes place. Odysseus is trying to get home, but he is plankte, he is being led about, and malapola, in many different ways. There's a map of everywhere he's going to go to, and you can quite clearly see how ridiculous it is. He goes everywhere, right? You think it would be a normal straight home journey to Ithaca, but he's being led about to other places, and we'll find out why he gets led about. But he's polutropon, right? So despite being turned about in many different ways, he is himself a man of many different turns, so he adapts. And this is something you see throughout the Odyssey. This link between the words that are used that you don't get in English. Because polutropon, as I said before, is from polus, meaning many. And we see here malapola. That polla is the same word, is just a conjugated form of polus. Alright, moving on. Epe troye sierron botoliatron me person. The previous translation. Speak to me, O Muse, about the man of ever-changing identities, who was made to be led to veer off course in many different ways, after he sacked the sacred city of Troy. So again, this is just saying that all this started happening after the events of the Iliad, after the city of Troy was sacked. And it's very interesting they say the sacred city. So it's implying that Odysseus is kind of a bad guy. You know, why did he sack it? Or almost like the events to come are some kind of retribution for having sacked the city. Alright, the word I want to focus on here is epe. This is an interesting word. Now it means, in this case, after, as it's accompanying an aorist to express a complete action. So after he sacked. But the word can also come with a causal sense, meaning since. Now if we substitute that in, since he sacked sacred city of Troy, that changes the meaning quite a bit. He was made to veer off course in many different ways since he sacked the city of Troy, because he sacked the city of Troy. So this relates to the idea of possibly the gods having their retribution. The thing that makes it even more interesting is that, and we'll get to this, Zeus in his opening speech addressing the gods deflects the blame that mortals place on the gods for things that happen. And Zeus goes on about how the mortals always blame us, you know, when really it's their own actions and their own recklessness that leads to their suffering, their ills. Whereas in the Iliad, on line 5, it says, Dios de tele tobule, meaning Zeus's plan coming to fulfillment, or was coming to completion. This is quite clearly blaming Zeus for the events of the Iliad. It's all part of his plan, it's his will. But in the Odyssey, it's the opposite. Zeus has nothing to do with it, as we'll find out later. He deflects the blame. So is Zeus lying? Is there a cohesive narrative between the Iliad and the Odyssey in regards to the role that the gods play in the events of the immortals? And Gregory Nash had some great commentary on this again. He said that the apparent contradiction is due to, it represents the two extreme beliefs of the Greeks at that time, around 7th, 8th century BC. There were those that blamed the gods for everything that happened, and then there were those that only blamed themselves and other mortals. So instead of these two trying to represent a cohesive narrative in the events that happened with the gods, it's just stating what people believed. It's a contrast, right? So I think it's quite easy just to disregard this and saying, okay, it's just the superstitious Greeks, right? They believed in all manner of crazy things. But I think it's relating to something very core of humanity, of human beings, which is how we place blame and where we place blame. So to the Greeks, there were those that placed blame on external factors, the gods, whereas there were other Greeks who placed blame on themselves, on things that were within their control. There's this idea in psychology called locus of control. Either you have an internal or an external locus of control. The external locus of control means you're blaming others, you're blaming outside things for things that happen to you. So for example, if you miss the bus, you would blame that on the bus. You know, they arrived too early or too late, or blame it on something else, why you arrived late. Whereas an internal locus of control is where you blame yourself. You blame yourself for missing the bus, you know, not arriving there too early. This is a more universal thing. It's not just something that applies just to the Greek world, but to human beings. Alright, that's all I'm going to do for now. Until next time. See you all.